The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to St. Luke. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to share the inheritance with me." He replied to him, "Friend, who appointed me as your judge and arbitrator?" Then Jesus said to the crowd, "Take care to guard against all greed. For though one may be rich, one's life does not consist of possessions." Then he told them a parable. There was a rich man whose land produced a bountiful harvest. He asked himself, "What shall I do? For I do not have space to store my harvest." Then he said, "This is what I shall do. I shall tear down my barns and build larger ones. There I shall store all my grain and other goods. And I shall say to myself, 'Now as for you, you have so many good things stored up for many years. Rest, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this night your life will be demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, to whom will they belong? Thus will it be for all who store up treasure for themselves, but are not rich in what matters to God." The Gospel of the Lord. I'm sorry it's a little bit toasty in here. Something's wrong with our air conditioner. You know, today, air conditioners just don't have simple thermostats or switches on and off. No, you have a computer. So something's wrong with the computer. Go figure that one out. But you know what? It's better than hell. So here we are. And also, there's divine judgment involved here, because all of those who've always said it's too cold in your church, God's punishing you right now. Simple as that. So, anyway, June 30th traditionally marks the end of the fiscal year for most companies, and even parishes in our diocese. So with that, time is given to finalizing the books, preparing the financial statements, getting ready for the audit, and so on. And so we have the basic lesson that I learned in accounting. When you look at the balance sheet, your assets better exceed your liabilities. And you look at the income statement, income ought to exceed your expenses. You're supposed to make a profit in all of this. Well, even in your families, you know you have to be prudent in how you manage your wealth. So you have to manage, as a good steward, the cash flow. You need to pay your utilities every month and the mortgage, save for college education or perhaps retirement, or to buy something special like a new car, something of that nature. And that's all good. God has entrusted to us these blessings. We should manage them. We should live a good life, as well as be mindful of those in need. The real challenge, though, for us is that in our society, it's so easy to be caught up with things or money, to see what other people have and say, I have to have that too. And this is what our Lord warns us today. Jesus says, guard against all greed. One's life does not consist of possessions. Poor victims of original sin that we are, we could easily have greed erupt in our soul. Greed is a disordinate desire, so something that's not ordinary, not prudent financial stewardship, but greed is that disordered desire for money or for material things. Greed involves accumulating, having to have. Like, think in the gospel passage today. When Jesus speaks of the parable, notice the operative word is I. The man says, I have a great harvest. I need bigger storage bins. I have all I need for years. I will eat, drink, and be merry. Sadly, greed can lead us then into a sense of self-sufficiency, complacency towards the needs of others, and even a sense of independence of God. I have all that I need. I have my kingdom. Such greed, as St. Paul says, is idolatry, because something takes the place of God in our lives. The irony is that, and our Lord warns us in the parable, we can lose it at any moment. We could have the natural disaster, or there's the economic depression or recession. The stock market crashes, and ultimately, we die. So what do we take with us? When we think of the old pyramids, they were filled with all kinds of stuff that was left behind. When you see a funeral procession, you don't see a U-Haul following the hearse. It's simple as that. It's all left behind. We have to give then an accounting to God. And God doesn't look at all those material things, because we stand before the Lord empty-handed. But what our Lord does look at is all the good that has been inscribed in our heart, all those good things that we have done with the wealth, the material things that have been entrusted to our care. For good reason, greed is one of the 7 capital sins, meaning that it can become so pervasive, it becomes a mortal sin. It kills that sanctifying grace, can even lead us to hell. Dante, in the Divine Comedy, the section The Inferno, is taking this tour of hell, and he comes to this place where he meets a deceased person he knows, whose nickname was Chiaco, means pig. So you might want to remember that someday. So pig, the hog. So Chiaco is asked, why are all these souls here? And Chiaco says, pride, envy, and greed sparked the fires of these souls. So what do we do? Well, to keep our life in balance, we have to practice, first of all, a virtue of humility. Humility comes from the Latin humus, meaning dirt. So in humility, we recognize everything's a gift from God. We may have worked for it, but God gave us that ability, and God has entrusted that to our care. So in humility, we recognize everything's a gift from God, and we're called to use it wisely, and not just for our own needs, but for those who are entrusted to our care, for those who are in need, and for the service of the Lord. So it's not about our kingdom, it's about God's kingdom. And then with that, St. Paul says, seek what is above, where Christ is seated. Think of what is above, not of what is on the earth. With that humility, then, we're led to frugality. Now, frugality is not being cheap or miserly. To be a frugal person means a person appreciates what he has, but then he asks himself, why do I need this? Do I really need this? What am I going to do with this? How much do I really need? Those are good questions. When we think of trying to keep pace with everyone else in the neighborhood, we should be asking ourselves, do I really need that? What good is it going to bring me? So frugality is managing our material wealth wisely. And then comes moderation. Moderation means that we don't give into excess, but we don't give into defect. So we aren't frivolous in our spending, but we aren't also cheap in our spending either. We use things rightly. A good practice of the Old Testament was always giving the first fruits back to God. In the Old Testament, we hear of tithing, even giving the top 10%, not the bottom 10%, not what's left over, but rather giving first to God. And that's a good practice when we think of it. If we think of our income, whatever we have, and thinking, well, this much is going to go to God, church, charities, whatever, and then I'll live on the rest, we'll be happier. We aren't going to have as much anxiety because we're living more within our means. And so we look at that practice of moderation and we see what we have, but also how we're going to use that. So, my brothers and sisters, when we think of this, we have humility, frugality, moderation, and that keeps us on the right path in this life. Consider in our church, we have many saints who had great wealth, power, possessions. Saints like King St. Louis of France, Queen Elizabeth of Hungary, Queen Margaret of Scotland, King Henry of Germany, Blessed Karl of Austria. They had all kinds of stuff, but they weren't greedy. They recognized gift of God, and they used it rightly. In our American society, though, I think of one of our great saints, St. Catherine Drexel. She was born in 1858 in Philadelphia. Her family came over, her grandparents did. They started a banking business. They became very wealthy. They also founded Drexel University. They also founded many charitable institutions like orphanages, churches, and the like. While they were very wealthy, they remembered God gave them all these gifts. So Catherine and her two sisters were raised by a very good stepmother, and once a week they would open the pantry to their big home, and the poor could come, receive food, sometimes clothing. On special days like Christmas, other holidays, the stepmom would take the girls down to like the orphanage or even the hospital, and they would distribute toys, sweets, other gifts. So they had a consciousness that what God had given to them, they were supposed to use that rightfully for the good of all. Now keep in mind what's going on in our country at this time. So the Civil War's ended. Now we have the Industrial Revolution, and many people become very wealthy, extravagantly so. We know of the names of like the Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Carnegies, and so on. If you go to Newport, Rhode Island, there are these huge mansions like the Breakers, Marble House, and so on. They built these mansions sort of like to try to exceed the other person in opulence. The story goes in the 1880s, the Vanderbilts had this very luxurious kind of party. And they invited all the notaries and so on, the notables. And so they had this special turtle soup. Well, each turtle cost more than the whole annual wage of these factory workers. And then, after dinner, the men retired to the billiard room and they lit their cigars using $100 bills. Now, $100 back then was a lot more than it is today. And you have to think, there's greed. But also, we have to remember, what are those homes today? Museums. Simply museums. But Mother Catherine Drexel, when she was 30 years old, both parents had died, she became one of the wealthiest women in the United States. Huge fortune. So she went to Rome, like on a pilgrimage, to pray. She met with Pope Leo XIII, and she told him about the plight of our country, about the American Indians that had now been put on the reservations, about the freed black Americans that used to be slaves, but now there was segregation, there was poor living conditions in the inner cities of the North and the like. And Pope Leo XIII said, well, why don't you do something about that? Well, that thought caught her. And she thought, well, I could do something to start a community dedicated to serve these people. She founded what we call today the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament for the Native Americans and colored people. Even in our own state, she founded our own diocese, St. Joseph's Parish and School in Alexandria. That was founded to serve the colored people because we had segregation. But she founded that, funded it. By the time of her death in 1955, her community had founded over 60 schools, missions on the reservations, and even a university, Xavier University in Louisiana, which was the first university dedicated to the black people. And so, my brothers and sisters, we look at this woman and we see a person who didn't hoard it all in, who didn't say, I need more, I have to show others how much I have. Instead, she was truly that one who gave. She writes to her sisters later on, and she said, I more than ever realized how all things temporal pass away, and that there is but one home, strictly speaking, that eternal home where we all hope to meet our own and where there will be no separation anymore. And so temporal things, after all, are only to be valued inasmuch as they bring us and many others, as many as possible, to the same eternal joys for which we were all created. We are all called to be saints. All of us. Do not forget that. And so her mark was the sign of the cross, not the dollar sign. So my brothers and sisters, when we pass from this life and we have to give the accounting of our life, our balance sheet better have more spiritual assets than spiritual liabilities. And we have to think, we don't want our Lord to look at us and say, you fool. Rather, we want our Lord to say, well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into my rest. May God bless you.